Ettore, interpreter, Marco, the surgeon, Bamal, the physician, Alonso de la Calle, and Gabriel Sanchez. The reference is The International Jew by Henry Ford. Gabriel Sanchez, abetted by the other 4 Jews, sold Columbus on the idea of capturing 500 Indians and selling them as slaves in Seville, Spain, which was done. Columbus did not receive any of the money from the sale of the slaves, but he became the victim of a conspiracy fostered by Bamal, the ship's doctor. He, Columbus, suffered injustice and imprisonment as his reward, betrayed by the 5 Marranos, or Jews, whom he had trusted and helped. This, ironically, was the beginning of slavery in the Americas. The source is Adventures of an African Slaver, published in 1928, page 11. The Jews were expelled from Spain on August 2nd, 1492, and from Portugal in 1497. Many of these Jews immigrated to Holland, where they set up the Dutch West Indies Company to exploit the New World. In 1654, the first Jew, Jacob Bar Simpson, immigrated from Holland to New Amsterdam, or New York. And in the next decade, many more followed him, settling along the East Coast, principally in New Amsterdam and Newport, Rhode Island. They were prevented by ordinances issued by Governor Peter Stuyvesant from engaging in the domestic economy, so they quickly discovered that the territory inhabited by the Indians would be a fertile field. There were no laws preventing the Jews from trading with the Indians. The first Jew to begin trading with the Indians was Hyman Levy, who imported cheap glass beads, textiles, earrings, armbands, and other cheap adornments from Holland, which were traded for valuable fur pelts. Hyman Levy was soon joined by Jews Nicholas Lowe and Joseph Simon. Lowe conceived the idea of trading rum and whiskey to the Indians and set up a distillery in Newport, where these 2 liquors were produced. Within a short time, there were 22 distilleries in Newport, all of them owned by Jews, manufacturing and distributing firewater. The story of the debauching of the Indians, with its resultant massacres of the early settlers, is a dramatic story in itself. It is essential to comprehend the seaport of Newport. It is important in order to recognize the Jewish share in the slave commerce. There was a period when it was commonly referred to as, quote, the Jewish Newport World Center of Slave Commerce, unquote. Altogether at this time, there were, in North America, 6 Jewish communities: Newport, Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, and Savannah. There were also many other Jews, scattered over the entire East Coast. Although New York held first place in the settlers of Jews in North America, Newport held second place. New York was also the main source of kosher meat, supplying the North American settlements, then the West Indies, and also South America. Now Newport took over. Newport also became the great trade harbor of the East Coast of North America. There, vessels from other ports met to exchange commodities. Newport, as previously mentioned, represented the foremost place in the commerce of rum, whiskey, and liquor dealings. And to include, it finally became the main center of slave dealings. It was from this port that the ships left on their way across the ocean to gather their black human cargo and then derive great sums of money in exchange for them. An authentic contemporary report based on authority indicates that of 128 slave ships, for instance, unloaded in Charleston within 1 year, their cargo, 120 of these were undersigned by Jews from Newport and Charleston by their own name. About the rest of them, one can surmise, although they were entered as Boston, Norfolk, and Baltimore. Their real owners were similarly the Jewish slave dealers from Newport and Charleston. One is able to assess the Jewish share in the entire dealings of Newport if one considers the undertaking of a lone Jew, Portuguese Aaron Lopez, who plays an important part in the overall story of the Jews and slavery. Concerning the entire commerce of the colonies and the later state of Rhode Island, which included Newport, bills of lading, concessions, receipts, and port clearances carried the signature name of Jew Aaron Lopez. This also took place during the years 1726 to 1774. He had, therefore, more than 50% of all dealings under his personal control for almost 50 years. Aside from that, there were other ships which he owned, but sailed under other names. In the year 1749, the first Masonic Lodge was established. 90% of the members of this first lodge, 14 all told, were Jews, and one knows that only so-called prominent individuals were accepted. 20 years later, the second Masonic Lodge, or King David, was established. It is a fact that all of these members were Jews. In the meantime, the Jewish influence in Newport had reached such proportions that President George Washington decided to pay them a visit. Upon his appearance, both of the Masonic lodges sent an emissary, a Jew named Moses Sysax, to approach the president with a petition in which the Jews of Newport stated, quote, "If you will permit the children of Abraham to approach you with a request, to tell you that we honor you and feel an alliance," and then, quote, "Until the present time, the valuable rights of a free citizen have been withheld. However, now we see a new government coming into being based on the majesty of the people, a government not sanctioning any bigotry nor persecution of the Jew, rather to concede the freedom of thought, which each shares, whatever nation or language, as a part of the great government machine," unquote. It is necessary at this point to consider the disclosures as to who, in reality, obtained this legendary freedom in America at the founding of the Union. To be sure, the province became independent and severed from the English jurisdiction. However, we can see from the petition which Moses Sysax offered President Washington in the name of the Jews of Newport, that it was not in reality this type of freedom which they had in mind. They were merely concerned about themselves and their, quote, "own civil rights," unquote, which had been withheld. Therefore, following the Revolutionary War, the Jews were accorded equal rights and freed of all restrictions. And the Negroes? Well, the Revolutionary War notwithstanding, they remained slaves. In the year 1750, 1/6 of the population in New York was Negroid, and proportionately in the southern parts of the country, they outnumbered the others. But the proclamation of freedom did not touch them.
Men are created equal. Indeed, Brother Washington, all Freemasons meet as equals, and we have an opportunity to create a nation in the very essence of Masonic morality.
Let us scrutinize at close range this dismal handiwork of the Jews, which gave them influence and power, so we may comprehend the slave trade. For there has been so much written since that time by the zealous Jewish writers, that at the present, long since removed, it might appear natural, for the time element has a tendency to make things nebulous. Let us follow the journey of one ship owned by a slave dealer, Aaron Lopez, which had made many trips to the African coast. For instance, in the month of May 1752, the ship Abigail was equipped with about 9,000 gallons of rum, a great supply of iron foot and hand restraints, pistols, powder, sabers, and a lot of worthless tin ornaments, and under the command of the Jewish Captain Friedman, sailed off for Africa. There were but 2 mates and 6 sailors comprising the crew. 3½ months later, they landed on the African coast. Meantime, there had been constructed an African agency by the Jewish slave dealers, who had corralled them and prepared them for sale.
Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1870, more than 11 million men and women were carried across the Atlantic Ocean in ships like these. The passengers were forcibly transported from Africa to the West Indies, Brazil, or other lands of the Americas. These people were enslaved Africans, and their lives on board the slave ships were filled with pain, suffering, and death. In the 1500s, Europeans saw enslaved Africans as a source of inexpensive labor for their colonies. European planters established plantations or huge farms in North America, South America, and the Caribbean. As the plantations grew, more slaves were needed to work on them.
This organization, reaching deep into Africa, had many ramifications, including the heads of groups, villages, etc. This method to win over these leaders for the Jewish slave trade was similar to that which the Jews had employed with the Indians. At first, they presented them with rum, and soon found themselves in an alcoholic delirium. When the gold dust and ivory supply was exhausted, they were induced to sell their descendants. At first their wives, and then their youths. Then they began warfare among each other, plotted and developed mostly by the Jews. And if they captured prisoners, these too were exchanged for rum, ammunitions, and weapons to the Jews, using them for further campaigns to capture more Negroes.
Slavery had existed in Africa since ancient times. Some African kings and merchants captured people and sold them as slaves to European traders, as well as to Arab merchants. When the demand grew, kings often sent their warriors to attack neighboring villages for slaves. The Europeans treated slaves like cargo. They were locked inside cells for weeks until ships could take them to colonies across the ocean.
The captured blacks were linked 2 by 2 and driven through the medieval forests to the coast. These painful treks required weeks, and some of them frequently became ill and felled by exhaustion, and many unable to rise, even though the bullwhip was applied as an encourager. They were left to die and were devoured by wild beasts. It was not unusual to see the bones of the dead laying in the tropical sun, a sad and gruesome reminder of those who would later on tread this path. It has been calculated that for each Negro who withstood the rigors of this wandering, there still had to be the long voyage across the ocean before they reached American soil. 9 out of 10 died. And when one considers that there was a yearly exodus of 1 million black slaves, then, and only then, can one assess the tremendous and extensive exodus of the African people. At present, Africa is thinly populated, not alone due to the 1 million literally dragged out of huts, but due to the 5 to 9 million who never reached their destination. Once they reached the coast, the black slaves were driven together, and restraints were applied to hold them until the next transport ship docked. The agents, many of them Jews, who represented the chief, then began the deal with the captain. Each Negro was personally presented to him, but the captains had learned to become suspicious. The black one must move his fingers, arms, legs, and the entire body to ensure that there were not any fractures. Even the teeth were examined. If a tooth was lacking, it lowered the price. Most of the Jew agents knew how to treat sick Negroes with chemicals in order to sell them as sound. Each Negro was valued at about 100 gallons of rum, 100 pounds of gunpowder, or in cash between $18 to $20. The notations of a captain inform us that on September 5th, 1763, one Negro brought as much as 200 gallons of rum, due to the bidding amongst the agents raising the price. Women under 25 years, pregnant or not, resulted in the same measure if they were well and comely. Any over 25 years lost 25%. And here it should be stated that those Negroes purchased free at the African coast for $20 to $40 were then resold by the same slave dealers in America for $2,000. This gives one an idea how the Jews managed to acquire tremendous fortunes. Following the bargaining, Captain Friedman paid the bill, either in merchandise or cash. He also recalled some advice which his Jewish employers gave him as he left Newport for Africa. Quote, "Pour as much water into the rum as you possibly can," unquote. In this manner, the Negro chiefs were cheated 2 times by the Newport Jews. The next step was to shave the hair from the head of the acquired slaves. Then they were bound and branded with a hot iron, either on the back or the hip, identifying them with their owners. Now the Negro slave was indeed the property of the Jewish purchaser. If he fled, he could be identified. Following this procedure, there was a farewell celebration. There were instances when entire families were brought out of the interior to the coast.